Today we're going to talk about René Descartes. Descartes is a thinker whose work it is difficult to overestimate the importance of. Descartes is called the father of modern philosophy, or the father of modern science even. And his work laid the foundation for and strongly headed in the direction in the trajectory of modern science and modern thinking. So we owe a great debt to Descartes, both in the sciences and in the philosophical world. You might recognize Descartes' Latin name, Cartesius. When we speak of Cartesian thinking, or even the Cartesian coordinate system, we are talking about Descartes and Descartes' work. Before we can know reality, we must know about the apparatus through which we perceive it. This is Descartes. His thought here that before we can know anything about the external world, we must know something about the mind. We must know how it is that we're getting this information. This is really almost an obvious claim for us now. Doubting the senses and questioning the sense data that we get in is something that we are very accustomed to, if nothing else by way of sort of a comical rendition of a philosopher thinking about, am I dreaming right now, or am I awake? Are you really there, or are you just a figment of my imagination, an artifact of my mind? We're used to asking these kind of questions now, whether for fun or in all seriousness. But this kind of thinking began, and Descartes laid the groundwork, I think, for much of this to be taken seriously. In other words, for us to study the mind and question our thinking in a systematic way, so as to really call into question, what do we know about the external world? What can we know for certain? And this question and this line of questioning, this method of questioning is what makes Descartes unique. And really, as it is with the pre-Socratic thinkers and with Thales perhaps in particular, Descartes' work is interesting more for the kind of thinking that he was doing than necessarily for any one of the ideas in particular. Although you may be familiar with some of them. If you're familiar with I think, therefore I am, for instance, this is Descartes from the Meditations, which we're reading for this class. This was important in Descartes' thinking because this is the first thing that he knew for certain. This is the first thing that he could say with any certainty and make any sort of substantive knowledge claim about. And from there, he built up the existence of the real world and beyond to the existence of the Christian God. But what's really interesting about Descartes, as I mentioned, isn't necessarily his ideas in particular so much as the way that he was thinking. What it was that he was doing that was different from the philosophers before him sets him apart and makes him very interesting for us to study in the history of Western intellectualism, and also very interesting with respect to the kind of science and philosophy that was going to be done after his. The natural light of reason, as he called it. We think of things, or we should be thinking using the natural light of reason. We should endeavor to be guided by the natural light of reason. And by this, what Descartes seemed to be saying was that authority was not necessary, and that what other people said was not necessary to consider. In other words, you didn't have to worry about, in this case in particular, Catholic authority. You didn't have to worry about what the Pope said about something. You didn't have to worry about what any of the great minds in whatever discipline it was happened to say about the topic that you're thinking about. If you are guided by your own natural light of reason, your own reason, then you can reason correctly and come to a sound conclusion, regardless of what other people had to say about the topic. Now, this is something that is really nothing special for us. We're familiar with this. If you're reasoning correctly, who cares if King so-and-so happens to contradict what it is that you have to say on the topic? If you're reasoning well, then it doesn't matter. And this is ultimately what Descartes was pointing to. And remember, I mentioned last time with the separation between the church and the church's hegemony over intellectualism in general, that separation, that increase in thinking for oneself is what characterizes this period, just as it characterized the ancient Greek period as well. This is especially interesting, of course, during Descartes' time, because we're talking about some of the philosophy and thinking and style of thinking in particular that was necessary for a movement like Protestantism to exist at all and to do as well as it did and to take root as it did. The thinking that one should come to a knowledge of God and be able to read for oneself from the holy texts and be able to understand them without the use of the institutions, the Catholic Church, was crucial, of course, to this movement. So it's not surprising then, I should think, that Descartes arrived at the time that he did, that Protestantism began at the time that it did. Again, I would refer you to Tarnas for a more complete story involving the history before Descartes and what led up to his style of thinking and what implications that had both inside philosophy and theology after that time. All right. So if each person can determine what's true on their own, and each person can be led by their own reason, then this, again, like much of the other philosophy that was done in this period, did not necessarily work to Christianity's favor. Because if you no longer had to rely on the authority of the church, and it was possible to think about things critically for yourself, then of course it was always possible that you were going to come to conclusions that were not orthodox, and even conclusions about religion and about reading from the scriptures that were not orthodox and not in line with traditional theology. So there then allowed for the possibility of exactly what we saw, the splintering into sects of the Protestant churches and the various flavors of Protestantism that arose thereby. Because you were no longer held by the authority of a central figure, it became possible then for everyone to say that, okay, well, my interpretation of this, my understanding of this is just as good as yours, and I have my own revelation. You may have yours, but that's fine, And so you have this splintering effect that can take place when there's no one central figure governing interpretation and governing understanding. So this is again, perhaps an obvious thing for theology. For the scientific world, the consequences were equally great, although I think probably a good deal more positive with respect to their development. The university system, of course, if you're no longer held down by authority in particular, that means you don't have to hang on to old ideas just because they are old and just because they are popular. And you don't have to take someone's word for something, and everything then can be peer-reviewed based upon pure reason, essentially, hopefully at least. And this allows, I think, for a greater degree of freedom and hopefully a greater degree of honesty and perhaps even something that approaches objectivity in scientific thinking. Well, these are all the ideas, at least, possibilities that maybe we could head in that direction, regardless of what the actuality was with respect to any of those. And I'm thinking of objectivity in particular. While it's certainly the case that shortly after Descartes' time, and I'm thinking especially with the writing of Newton's Principia, we certainly wanted to be very objective and wanted to be very objective about the mechanics of the physical world in particular. We have reasons, I think, for thinking later on that this may not entirely be the case. So anyway, we'll get to some of that as we proceed through the semester. All right. So Descartes' method for arriving at truth was to reason, and to reason using reason alone. And the truths, he said, are really only truths. We really only know them to be true if they are verifiable via our reason alone and perhaps some observation. But nevertheless, concentrated with, central to, a single mind. In other words, you had to figure things out for yourself. And that notion of figuring things out for yourself proved both a great thing for scientific exploration and also somewhat problematic for the Catholic Church. Descartes went on to describe this, and then the method I'm describing here is essentially hyperbolic doubt. And if you're familiar with the term hyperbole from your work in English, perhaps, and literature, then you have a sense, I think, of what Descartes had in mind with this. Extreme doubt that has been taken to an exaggerated extreme. In other words, doubting everything. And if I doubt everything and then try to build up the world for my own reason, how far can I get? Now, we're somewhat comfortable with, and this is partially built upon some of the thinkers that followed Descartes, we're somewhat comfortable with the idea that, well, you can't really build up anything at all. And this creates real problems for epistemology and for knowledge of anything. Descartes, of course, is not going to come to those conclusions, but he allowed for those conclusions certainly to be much more well-received, more popular, let's say, and philosophically plausible to the ensuing generations of philosophical thinkers. So, Descartes' work trying to purify, you might say, philosophy, and although he may not have been entirely aware of it, separate it somewhat, is what he is really the most famous for, the most well-known for, and the most influential with, I believe, in that his method of thinking in using hyperbolic doubt, thinking for yourself, using only your reason, and trusting nothing unless it stood up to the scrutiny of reason. That is a fairly new push and a new trend in philosophy and in especially in theology, of course. And this is something that has lasted into the present day. As I mentioned, it serves us very well in the sciences, and it made him famous for his work with synthesizing philosophy and theology, his crusade against skepticism, because ultimately the meditations, at least ostensibly, are to help stamp out atheism. And anyone who would claim that knowledge was impossible, as I just mentioned, even though Descartes basically paves the way for this kind of thinking, he fought this bitterly in thinking that, apparently believing his writing in the meditations, that this kind of skepticism was not founded and could be extinguished via one's own reason, as he did in the process of the meditations. Now, one thing is kind of interesting to note with this, and I say ostensibly he said this. Well, there's a good reason that I say this. You see, it was still very unpopular for someone to disagree with the church, and very unpopular is something of a euphemism in this case. We're all familiar with the story of Galileo and how much difficulty he met with, shall we say, when the church condemned his writings, his dialogue, in 1632. And it was some time, of course, before this was redressed. Descartes was going to support this and was an advocate of heliocentrism, and this is evident by examining his work, Le Monde, which means the world, that would have been published in 1633. Now, I mentioned that Galileo's dialogue was published in 1632, or was condemned in 1632, so this was never published by Descartes. So obviously he had some differences with the church at the time, and how deep these differences ran, we can only speculate, because of course it would have been very dangerous for him to have written any of this down. So when we read, one of the reasons that I mention this, when we read the dedication to the meditations, we read about the sacred and honorable faculty of theology. Well, he goes on to say that it is evident, and everyone knows that God exists. We're not questioning this, basically making sure his work is as orthodox as possible before he goes about explicitly questioning it and explicitly calling into question everything in Christianity so that he can build things up again using reason alone. Now, ostensibly, again, he was an advocate of Christianity and an advocate of certain knowledge about Christianity. But at the same time, one could also argue that he couldn't have been anything but that had he hoped to have gotten his work published and accepted, especially insofar as that it was a different kind of thinking. And the idea of doubting, explicitly philosophically doubting Christianity and Christian doctrine was not something that the church would have liked very much. So his couching it as he did may have been more of a necessity than it was a profession of his own faith or belief. And this is not to say that Descartes was not a Christian. He seems to almost certainly have been a Christian, but to what extent that ran and how deep his faith was, especially insofar as it was orthodox and his interpretation of theology, we really don't know. Now, Descartes' method, as is outlined in the Meditations, to step through this bit by bit, essentially is to begin by accepting nothing is true unless it is crystal clear to the mind. So unless something has been shown beyond all doubt, then it should not be accepted as true. And this tends to be kind of a philosopher's mantra, or at least was for a very long time today, that one should use reason. And if something can't stand up to reason, then it should continue to be doubted until it can stand up to reason. Obviously, this makes things very difficult with subjects that are not ultimately provable via reason. So it's more of a court-martial approach, guilty until proven innocent, as opposed to the previous standard, which might have been the reverse, innocent until proven guilty. Now, we divide difficulties into parts so that they may be more easily understood, more easily examined. This is a very, of course, common approach to things, and one might even say a foundational scientific principle. Not to look at too many different things at once. Try to look at things in isolation so that you may understand them, and so that you may understand completely what something is caused by, insofar as it's possible. and then proceed very orderly by steps, and then enumerate all possibilities. Make sure you don't leave anything out. In other words, make sure that once you have reached a conclusion, that it is absolutely certain. Now, this is very important, of course, for the sciences, because if you're going to build upon the work of others, you don't want to build upon mistakes, and you don't want to build upon areas which still have room for doubt. You want to build upon areas that have been completely cleared of any problems, have been so thoroughly examined and comprehensively examined that there is no room left for doubt. Then we can confidently build on and begin to progress from there. That tends to be the approach that we take in the sciences, and in general in academia, this is the approach that we like to take. Now, of course, if we're going to try to do this with theology, it's not so easy. And ultimately, this very obvious application, really simply turning this to religion and saying, is this possible? There makes it very easy, I think, to understand why it is that these ideas are not entirely good news for the Christian orthodoxy at the time. Now, continuing on with Descartes' doubting of the senses, this is really a very important topic, and this is something he spends some time with in the Meditations. How thoroughly can we doubt the senses? What can we know for sure about the sense data that's coming in? So when I see something, how confident can I be that the thing that I'm seeing actually exists in reality? That I can go and touch it and it's going to be the same thing? Or are there cases where I see something, or at least I think I see something, and then later that's revised and it actually turns out to be something entirely different? Now, a mirage, for instance, is a great example of this. I think I see something, but in fact, it's not really what I thought I saw. Things that are in the distance, that are at a considerable distance from us, frequently give us this sort of illusion, where we think that we see things clearly and we have an object that's in mind. But once we look at it a little bit more closely, or perhaps once we get a little bit closer to it and can see it better, we realize that it's really not that object at all, that it's something else entirely. Maybe even a combination of objects that just happen to look that way. So it's clear to us, in other words, that there are occasions where our senses deceive us, and our brains essentially filter these things for us, give us the objects, in other words, recognize the objects for us, and it turns out to be wrong. Now, I mean this quite literally. We're going to speak of this as we go on in the semester as well, with respect to some of the experiments that have been done. Now, Descartes did not have the luxury of this sort of research being behind him, but as it turns out, we can show experimentally that our minds filter a great deal of information before it is ever presented to us, such that we can be consciously aware of it. And when I say filter, we're talking about on the order of, upwards of 90% of the information that comes in via our senses is never brought to conscious awareness. So because of this, you might argue, well, our brains are hiding things from us. Well, our brains are trying to help us out. Not everything that we get is important. Not all of the sense data that we have coming into us at all times is important. So it may be better to ignore some of these things. We can see this very easily, for instance, with repetitive noises. If you walk into it, and this works with smells to some degree as well, but I think the noises are probably a cleaner case. If you walk into a room, for instance, that has maybe a generator or something going, it can even be even something of an obnoxious noise. As long as it is a consistent stimulus, you will eventually get to the point where you effectively do not hear it. And you can measure this. If we're looking at brain activity, we can see that the person is no longer responding to that stimulus over time. Now it gradually disappears. But the point is, we eventually get to the point where we are not consciously aware of it. We can bring it to conscious awareness again, but it is not on the tip of our minds, so to speak. We are not aware of all things coming in at all times, even very obvious sense data. So really, the question is, how much of this can we doubt? How often are we wrong? And is it to the point where we have a significant problem with respect to our perception of reality? Now, the initial inclination is probably, as it was in Descartes' day, to simply say, well, no, we don't really have that much of a problem. Reality is very consistent, if nothing else, and our memory is very consistent. And those things alone show us and should give us a high degree of confidence in the external world that we have around us. But the work of other philosophers, namely Nietzsche and his ilk, brought into question the idea that we really have any kind of objectivity at all. In other words, we're always viewing the world through our subjective understanding of it. And even earlier than Nietzsche with Kant, as we'll cover momentarily, we really see the contents of our mind. We don't necessarily see the contents of the external world. We hope that the two are in line, but the mind comes first, as in we perceive things through our senses. So we are aware of our senses, and then hopefully we can infer something about the external world. But we are not necessarily guaranteed of this. Now, Descartes, in his progression, I mentioned, I think, therefore I am, his first proclamation where he said that, okay, now I'm confident again, I have knowledge of this. I may not have knowledge of anything else, but I have knowledge of this. Is this a justifiable leap? Just because we are thinking, does that mean that we can verify with absolute certainty that we exist? Or could we be fooled by it? Now, the problem there is that we're automatically enmeshed in a contradiction, mired in a contradiction, such that if we are thinking about it, then obviously we're going to think that we exist because it is implied in the statement. So one could question the logic of the argument. But nevertheless, this is typically seen as a very interesting argument at the very least, although it is still questioned by a number of thinkers. Now, obviously, if you question this, you're not really going to follow the rest of his argument, but he does continue. And after he's established his own existence, he tries to reconstruct and allow for the knowledge that we have in general, allowing for scientific knowledge, and then ultimately allowing for the existence and proof of the existence of God. That God is no deceiver, that he is not an evil demon. These are the sorts of things. How do we know that we are not being constantly deceived? That's another one of the questions that is addressed in the Meditations. All right, let's move on to Immanuel Kant. Now, Kant is a thinker that we could spend a great deal of time studying, but unfortunately, in the interest of moving along in philosophical history, we're only going to address a few major ideas, again, that you are likely to encounter in future philosophy courses or in general with respect to this thinker. The first is Kant's Copernican revolution. And as he says, it is the representation that makes the object possible, rather than the object making the representation possible. What this means is that previously people thought that, okay, you have these objects in the real world, and via effluences or whatever it is, we have some experience of them. So we can touch, taste, feel, hear what's going on in the world. And that emanates from whatever the object was. So you have the object, and then we have a representation of that is made possible in our mind by that object. And that's a reasonable and probably fairly common way of thinking about it. However, Kant turns this on its head and says that, in fact, it is the representation that makes the object possible, because ultimately all we ever know is the representation. The data, all the data that we have about the external world comes to us through our senses. So we have the representation first, and then we must infer the existence of the object from the material that we have available to us in our mind via memories and sense impressions and whatnot. Since, of course, memories are just the you might say, the fossils of perceptions past. Now, what this does is it makes the mind an active originator of experience. So instead of just being a passive recipient and perceiver, a receptacle for all the transmissions of the world, in other words, the sound waves and photons and these kind of things, it is in fact an active originator of experience, and we actively create the experience of reality in our minds. And because of this, it can be changed significantly in our minds. And this leads us, of course, to question, or at least paves the way for us to question most anything about the way that the external world actually is. And we have to then speculate on how significant is it that we only have the data through our senses. How much of a bias can possibly be introduced here? And I'm thinking in particular of mental illness. If we have a significant problem with the brain, how does that affect our perception of reality? How much can it affect our perception of reality? Is there a certain amount of reality that's going to get through no matter what? Or is all of it subject to variations and essentially warping of experience via our perceptive faculties? I don't propose to add the answer to that, but this is the kind of thing that has been suggested and made possible, this kind of speculation. has been rampant, you might say, since the time of Kant. Now, Kant wanted to critique reason in his Critique of Pure Reason. He wanted to critique reason so as to make possible faith, so as to clear the way for faith, as if reason was something of an impediment to our having faith. And it's on these pretenses that Kant did his work. And in particular, I want to raise here the issue of the categorical imperative. You see, Kant, and as would become typical during and after this time, wanted to make a science of ethics. And the thought was that we could divine certain things about ethics. We could discover certain truths via reason about ethics, using reason alone, not using authority necessarily, remember, but just using reason alone. So this is a very Cartesian approach, you might say. And this desire to make a science of ethics gives us hints of the sort of issues that we're dealing with now and trying to make a science out of everything. The idea might be expressed something like this: science has been so successful, that method of thinking has been so successful, that let's apply it to everything and see what we get. See if there is anything that is absolutely certain that we can learn, and wouldn't it be great and objective and pure and not subject to human corruption and authority and all the problems ensuing with subjective assessment of things, which seems to be a problem for, let's say, the humanities, or what we've now come to call the soft sciences and the like. So Kant's categorical imperative in the tradition of trying to make a science of ethics says that we can derive moral laws, ethical laws, using this principle of reason. Act only according to the maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So if you can take whatever action it is that you're contemplating and say, okay, is this right or wrong? Is it right for me to, murder? Then, well, can I make that a universal law? What if it was okay for everyone to do that? Well, society wouldn't last very long. The species wouldn't last very long. So yeah, that's probably not a very good idea. Therefore, murder is wrong. Okay. What about suicide? What about lying? What about stealing? And on and on and on. And Kant experienced a great deal of success with this. And this is very exciting that it looks as though we have a reasoned precept that allows us to derive moral laws and to derive ethical standards. Well, naturally, of course, and this may have led to some revision with Kant's work, and some people speculate on this in a rather unkind way to Kant, that he had to revise it because he was allowing for things with the categorical imperative that he would not have approved of. So there are a lot of things, for instance, that people could do. I don't think society would really explode, so to speak. I don't think it would be the end of the world, but it's probably not something Kant would have liked in his Lutheranism. And for instance, even the proclamation of various heresies, the using abusive language, let's say, a variety. There are a variety of examples of this kind, essentially in kind of victimless crime, and we can think of a number of things that people do consensually that are not approved of by the church, that we could will these to be universal laws, and it really would not cause complete societal disintegration or the death of the species. So Kant has something interesting with the categorical imperative, but it requires some revision and amendment to really keep the Ten Commandments, so to speak, to keep Christian ethics as its goal. Now, this is not to say that this is explicitly what was intended there. This is sort of a tongue-in-cheek rendition of this sort of thinking, but the fact that Kant published this, you have a lot of backlash and counterexamples, and he revised it several times, leads us to believe that he did have something in mind that was not simply given by the initial version of the categorical imperative.